My name is Valerie, and I'm 57 years old. I spent my whole life making sure my son Thomas never went without. I worked 3 jobs, built a successful real estate career, and even bought him and his wife Grace a beautiful house as a wedding gift. So when I got that text message saying I wasn't family and couldn't join their cruise, something inside me broke. But sometimes, breaking is just the first step to becoming whole again. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button while I explain how I discovered what family truly means when my own son tried to erase me. I became a single mother when I was just 26 years old. My husband James and I had been high school sweethearts, married young at 21, and had Thomas when I was 25. I thought we were building our dream life together, but one morning I woke up to a note on the kitchen counter. James had left us. No warning, no discussion, just gone. His note said he wasn't ready for the responsibility and that he needed to find himself. I later learned he had moved across the country with a coworker he had been having an affair with. Thomas was only 14 months old when James abandoned us. I remember sitting on the kitchen floor, clutching Thomas to my chest, sobbing until I had no tears left. That night, after I put Thomas to bed, I made myself a promise that my son would never feel the absence of his father in terms of love or financial security. I would become everything he needed. The first few years were brutally difficult. I had no college degree, limited work experience, and suddenly I was solely responsible for a toddler. I took whatever jobs I could find. During the day, I waited tables at a local diner where the manager let me adjust my schedule around Thomas's daycare. At night, after Thomas was asleep, I did bookkeeping for small businesses from our tiny apartment. On weekends, I cleaned houses in the wealthy neighborhoods across town. I missed so many precious moments of Thomas's early childhood because I was working. His first steps happened at daycare. When he said his first complete sentence, it was to his babysitter. I have a vivid memory of rushing to pick him up from daycare after a double shift, only to find him crying because I had missed the little end-of-year program where he played a tree. The daycare worker had taken photos, but it wasn't the same as being there. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. I survived on 4 hours a night for years, often falling asleep over my bookkeeping spreadsheets, only to jerk awake at 2 a.m. with pencil marks on my face and the knowledge that I had to be up at 5 a.m. for my morning shift. When Thomas was 7, I caught a break. One of the homeowners whose house I cleaned was a successful real estate agent. She noticed how meticulously I organized her home office and how quickly I calculated measurements when helping her rearrange furniture. She suggested I get my real estate license, offering to mentor me. I studied at night after Thomas went to bed, passing the exam on my first try when I was 32. Real estate became my salvation. I discovered I had a talent for it. My background as a cleaner gave me an eye for staging homes, and my bookkeeping experience helped me understand the financial aspects. Most importantly, my years of struggle gave me empathy for first-time homebuyers who were scared and overwhelmed. By the time Thomas was in middle school, I was making enough money from real estate to quit my other jobs. But even as our financial situation improved, I never forgot those early years of hardship. I continued to save aggressively, always afraid that everything could disappear again. I drove the same car for 15 years. I bought my clothes from discount stores. I packed lunches rather than eating out. Every extra dollar went into either Thomas's college fund or my emergency savings. Thomas was a sweet child, but I noticed his attitude toward money and possessions changing as he grew older. When he was around 10, he began comparing our life to those of his friends from more affluent families. He would come home from playdates at their large houses with swimming pools and game rooms, asking why we couldn't live like that. I explained that we were comfortable and blessed with what we had, but I also felt a twist of shame and inadequacy. By high school, Thomas had developed expensive tastes. He wanted designer clothes, the latest electronics, exclusive summer camps. I tried to teach him about budgeting and the value of money, but I also couldn't bear to see him feel left out. I often gave in working extra listings to afford the things he wanted. When he needed a car, instead of getting him something practical and used, I bought him a new sports car for his 16th birthday. The look of joy on his face seemed worth every penny and all the extra hours I worked to pay for it. For holidays and birthdays, I overcompensated for being a single-parent household. Christmas meant piles of presents under the tree. For his birthdays, I threw elaborate parties once, even renting out an entire amusement park for him and 30 friends. I wanted Thomas to have the childhood I never had, full of joy and free from worry about money. Looking back, I can see the warning signs of his entitlement, but at the time, I dismissed them as normal teenage behavior. When he complained about the birthday car being the wrong color, I told myself he was just being a typical teen. When he expected me to do his laundry while he played video games, I rationalized that he was busy with school and sports. When he rarely thanked me for the sacrifices I made, I told myself that children aren't supposed to understand what parents go through. Thomas went to college at 18, attending a prestigious private university that cost more than I had ever earned in a single year. I was so proud of him, and I willingly took out a second mortgage on our home to afford the tuition not covered by scholarships. During his sophomore year, he met Grace, and everything began to change even more. Grace came from a wealthy family with deep roots in New England society. Her father was a surgeon, and her mother came from old money. When Thomas first brought her home during spring break of their junior year, I was immediately struck by her perfect posture, designer clothes, and the way she subtly assessed our modest home with a quick, practiced glance. Still, she was polite and articulate. I prepared a special dinner, spending all day cooking Thomas's favorite foods. Grace barely touched her plate, mentioning that she was more accustomed to Mediterranean cuisine and that she found American comfort food a bit heavy. Thomas, who had always devoured my pot roast with enthusiasm, agreed with her, picking at his food and leaving most of it untouched. Over the next 2 years, I watched my son transform. His accent subtly changed, adopting the slight New England inflection of Grace's speech. He replaced his wardrobe with clothes I'd never be able to afford. His taste in music, food, literature all shifted to mirror hers. He began using words like summer as a verb and referring to his childhood home as quaint. When they announced their engagement during their senior year of college, I was happy for Thomas, but also sensed a growing distance. I expected to be involved in wedding planning, dreaming of mother-son dances and cake tastings. Instead, Grace's mother swiftly took control of everything. The wedding would be held at their summer home in the Hamptons. The guest list would be limited to avoid overcrowding. The theme would be tastefully traditional. I offered to help however I could, but was politely sidelined. When I suggested incorporating some of our family traditions, Grace's mother, Charlotte, smiled thinly and said, "We want to keep things consistent with the expectations of our circle." Thomas said nothing, avoiding my eyes. The only significant contribution I was permitted to make was financial. Grace's father called me directly, outlining what percentage of the wedding costs I was expected to cover as the mother of the groom. The number made my stomach drop, but I agreed without complaint. I would need to take out another loan, but I told myself it was worth it to be part of this special day. As the wedding approached, I felt increasingly irrelevant. At the rehearsal dinner, I was seated at a table far from the main party, with distant relatives who clearly considered me an oddity. I overheard one of Grace's aunts referring to me as the realtor mother, with a small laugh. It was during this period of feeling disconnected that I made a decision that seemed at the time like the perfect way to show my love and secure my place in my son's new life. I decided to use my life savings to buy them a house as a wedding gift. I spent weeks searching for the perfect property. It had to be in a prestigious neighborhood to satisfy Grace's standards, but also within my budget. I finally found it, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in an upscale area where many of Grace's family friends lived. The price was steep at $850,000, requiring me to liquidate my retirement accounts and take out yet another loan. But the thought of Thomas and Grace's joy made it seem worthwhile. When I presented them with the keys wrapped in a small box at their wedding reception, Thomas seemed genuinely moved. He hugged me tightly, whispering, "Thanks, Mom. This means everything." Grace was more restrained, but appeared pleased, especially when she learned the address was in her preferred zip code. The wedding itself was a lavish affair that made me feel desperately out of place. My simple designer dress, the most expensive garment I had ever purchased, looked plain next to the couture gowns of Grace's family. The ceremony was beautiful but formal, lacking the warmth and personality I had hoped for. Thomas and I had always joked about dancing to Sweet Child O' Mine at his wedding, but when the time came for the mother-son dance, the band played a classical piece I didn't recognize. Thomas explained that Grace thought our song choice was a bit gauche. As I watched my son pledge his life to Grace under an arbor of imported flowers that cost more than my first car, I felt a confusing mixture of pride, love, and loss. I told myself that this feeling of exclusion was temporary. Once they settled into their new home, I would be a regular visitor. I would cook Sunday dinners, help them decorate, eventually babysit my grandchildren. The house I had purchased would be the foundation of our continued close relationship. How wrong I was. The first few months after Thomas and Grace moved into the house I had bought them, I waited for an invitation to visit. I imagined a housewarming party, or at least a dinner, where they would proudly show me how they had decorated their new home. The invitation never came. I called Thomas weekly, trying to maintain our connection. Our conversations grew shorter and more formal. When I asked about visiting, there was always a reason. It wasn't convenient. They were renovating. Grace was redecorating. They had social obligations. After 3 months of excuses, I decided to take the initiative. I baked Thomas's favorite apple pie and drove to their house unannounced, telling myself that a mother doesn't need a formal invitation to visit her son. Grace answered the door in yoga clothes, her surprise quickly shifting to something that looked like annoyance. "Valerie, we weren't expecting company today," she said, not moving to let me in. "I'm not company. I'm family," I replied, with a smile, holding up the pie. "I thought I'd bring over a little treat and see how you're settling in." She reluctantly stepped aside, and I entered the house I had purchased but had never seen occupied. I barely recognized it. All the warm, neutral colors I had admired when buying the property had been replaced with stark whites and cool grays. The comfortable furniture had been exchanged for angular, modern pieces that looked beautiful but uninviting. Grace led me through a brief tour, pointing out the brands of their new furniture and the names of the designers who had helped them. When I mentioned that a cozy reading nook would look perfect in one corner, she replied, "We're going for a minimalist aesthetic, not country comfort." The way she said country comfort made it sound like a disease. Thomas arrived home an hour later. He seemed uncomfortable finding me there, giving me a quick, stiff hug before asking if I had called before coming over. When I reminded him that I used to love his surprise visits to my office, bringing lunch when I was busy with clients, he shrugged and said, "Things are different now. Grace likes to have time to prepare for guests." Again, that word. Guests. Over the next year, a pattern emerged. I was allowed into their lives on strictly controlled terms. I received formal invitations to dinner parties where I was seated among people I didn't know, expected to make small talk about subjects I had no knowledge of. Art exhibitions in New York, summer homes in Europe, boarding schools and Ivy League connections. Grace made small but cutting comments about my appearance and manners. "Oh, Valerie, that outfit is so practical," she would say with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Or, "In our circle, we generally don't discuss money at the dinner table," after I mentioned a successful house closing. Thomas never defended me. Sometimes he would even join in, gently correcting my table manners or changing the subject when I spoke about my work. The holidays were particularly painful. For Thanksgiving, I was invited to join them at Grace's parents' home. I brought my traditional sweet potato casserole, a recipe passed down from my grandmother. When I arrived, I discovered it had been relegated to a side table while a professional caterer served the main meal. No one touched my dish except me. During dinner, I sat silently as Grace's family discussed people and places unknown to me. When I tried to share stories about Thomas's childhood, Charlotte smoothly interrupted. Perhaps we should focus on more current topics. That night, as I drove home alone to my empty house, I cried for the first time since Thomas's wedding. I was losing my son, and I didn't know how to stop it. When Grace announced her pregnancy 6 months later, I felt a surge of hope. Surely a grandchild would secure my place in their family. I attended her baby shower, an extravagant event at a country club where I knew no one, and gave a handmade baby blanket I had spent months knitting, only to notice it was placed separate from the mountain of designer gifts. Later, I overheard Grace telling a friend that handmade items were sweet but a bit germy, and she probably wouldn't use it. Lucas was born on a spring morning, and I rushed to the hospital as soon as Thomas called. Grace's parents were already there, comfortably established in the private suite. Charlotte was holding the baby while Grace rested. I waited 2 hours before I was allowed to hold my grandson, and then only briefly before a nurse took him for tests. During Lucas's first year, I tried desperately to be involved. I offered to babysit to help with night feedings to take him for walks so the new parents could rest. Grace always had a reason to refuse. We have a night nurse for that. Mother is coming to help. We have a specific schedule we need to maintain. One afternoon, I arrived with a small gift for Lucas and overheard Grace on the phone through the open window. Valerie's here again, she was saying to someone. I know she means well, but she's just so working class. I don't really want her watching Lucas alone. What if he picks up her accent or her table manners? Thomas understands, but he doesn't know how to tell her to back off. I stood frozen on the doorstep, the colorful stuffed elephant I had brought clutched in my hand. Inside, I heard Thomas's voice murmuring in agreement with whatever Grace was saying. He wasn't defending me. He was agreeing that I was somehow not good enough to care for my own grandson. I nearly left without ringing the bell, but pride made me stay. I pressed the doorbell, plastered a smile on my face, and pretended I hadn't heard a word. But something had shifted inside me. I began to see the subtle ways they both undermined me. The constant corrections. The exchanged glances when I spoke. The way Lucas was whisked away whenever I tried to hold him for more than a few minutes. I tried to adapt. I took etiquette classes at the community college. I watched YouTube videos on how to speak with a neutral accent. I bought new clothes I couldn't afford, attempting to mimic Grace's understated but expensive style. None of it made a difference. The goalposts kept moving. There was always some new way I failed to meet their standards. When Lucas was 18 months old, Thomas called with what sounded like exciting news. We're planning a family cruise for the summer, he said. Grace's parents have rented a private yacht to sail around the Greek islands for 2 weeks. That sounds wonderful, I said, mentally calculating how much I would need to save to afford appropriate clothing and spending money for such a trip. When should I request time off work? There was an uncomfortable pause. Well, we're still finalizing the guest list, Thomas said vaguely. I'll let you know the details soon. I didn't hear anything more about the cruise for weeks. I saw photos of Grace shopping for resort wear on social media. I noticed Thomas taking time off work for what he called trip planning. Still, no formal invitation came my way. As the departure date approached, I finally called Thomas directly. I need to know about the cruise dates so I can make arrangements, I said, trying to keep my voice light and casual. Oh, about that, Thomas replied. I've been meaning to call you. It's going to be a pretty crowded boat with all of Grace's family. We're still not sure if there will be space for everyone. The message was clear, but I refused to accept the unspoken rejection. I don't mind a small cabin, I insisted. I just want to be there to spend time with you and Lucas. Thomas promised to get back to me, but days passed with no word. I began to fear what I already suspected deep down. I was being excluded from this family vacation. Still, I went shopping for cruisewear, buying a modest selection of sundresses and sandals I could return if necessary. I researched Greek culture and history so I could appreciate the destinations. I even bought a waterproof camera to capture memories with Lucas. Then the text message came that would change everything. I was watering my plants on a quiet Tuesday morning when my phone chimed. I smiled, expecting it might be a photo of Lucas from Thomas. Instead, what I read made my hands shake so badly that I dropped my watering can, flooding the hardwood floor. Mom, we've decided you're not coming on the cruise. This is for immediate family only, and Grace's parents are more part of our family unit than you. Please understand. I read the words over and over, unable to process their cruelty. Immediate family. Grace's parents were family, but I was not. My own son was telling me I didn't belong. I tried calling Thomas immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. I sent a text asking for an explanation. No response. I called again an hour later and again that evening. Nothing. The silence was somehow worse than the message itself. The next day, Thomas finally answered. His voice was cold and distant, as if he was speaking to a difficult client rather than his mother. Grace feels that you wouldn't be comfortable with the kind of people who will be on the cruise, he explained without emotion. Her parents' friends are very sophisticated, and there would be a lot of social events that might make you feel out of place. But I'm your mother, I whispered, my throat tight with unshed tears. And Lucas's grandmother. Look, Mom, Thomas said with a sigh that suggested I was being difficult. Just because you bought us the house doesn't mean you're entitled to be included in everything we do. We have our own life now, our own family unit. You need to respect our boundaries. The mention of the house stunned me. Was that how he saw my gift? As an attempt to buy my way into their lives? I had emptied my savings, liquidated my retirement accounts, taken on new debt in my 50s to give them that house. And now Thomas was throwing it in my face as if it were some manipulative gesture rather than an act of love. After we hung up, I sat in my living room surrounded by photos of Thomas growing up. Thomas on his first bike. Thomas at his high school graduation. Thomas in his college dorm. In each picture, he was smiling. And I was there beside him, supporting him, loving him without condition. When had I become someone to be ashamed of, to exclude, to dismiss? I broke down, completely sobbing, until my chest hurt and my eyes swelled. All those years of sacrifice, of putting his needs before mine, of making sure he never went without, even when it meant I did without. For what? To be told I wasn't family. To be less important than Grace's parents, who had never changed his diapers or stayed up all night with him when he had ear infections or worked 3 jobs to keep him fed. That night was one of the darkest of my life. I barely slept, tormented by thoughts of what I had done wrong, how I had failed as a mother, despite giving everything I had. By morning, my sadness had hardened into something else, a slow-burning anger and determination. I called my friend Diana, the only person who had stood by me through all the years of single motherhood and who had warned me that I was spoiling Thomas. I poured out everything that had happened, including the cruel text message. Diana listened without interrupting, then asked a question that changed everything. Valerie, whose name is on the deed to that house. I paused, confused by the shift in topic. Mine, I guess. I never formally transferred it to them. I was going to do it eventually, but with all the gift tax implications, my accountant suggested waiting. So legally, that's still your house, Diana said slowly. You're letting your ungrateful son and his snooty wife live in your house while they treat you like garbage. I hadn't thought of it that way. In my mind, the house was theirs from the moment I gave them the keys, regardless of whose name was on the paperwork. But Diana's words struck a chord. Why was I accepting such treatment from people living in a home I had purchased? What are you saying I should do? I asked, though a plan was already forming in my mind. I'm saying you have options, Diana replied. And it might be time to show Thomas and Grace that their actions have consequences. After our call, I sat at my kitchen table thinking deeply about what to do next. The cruise was scheduled to last 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which my son, his wife, and my grandson would be sailing around the Greek islands with Grace's family, all of them celebrating their exclusivity while I sat at home alone. Or I could take action. I called a real estate attorney that same day and scheduled an appointment for the following morning. The attorney confirmed what Diana had suggested: the house was legally still mine. I had paid for it in full, and the deed remained in my name. I had every right to sell it if I chose to. But they live there, I said, still wrestling with the idea. All their things are there. My grandson's nursery. Do they pay you rent? The attorney asked. No, it was a gift. Have they contributed to the property taxes or homeowner's insurance? No, I handle all of that. And how have they shown gratitude for this extremely generous gift? I had no answer that didn't make my chest ache. The attorney leaned forward. Mrs. Newman, I'm not telling you what to do, but legally you have options. If you decide to sell the property, we would need to follow proper procedures, including giving them legal notice. But since they'll be away on this cruise, the timing might actually work in your favor. I left his office with a plan taking shape. I would put the house on the market while they were gone. With my real estate connections, I could expedite the process. By the time they returned, it might already be sold. I spent the next few days preparing. I verified that Thomas, Grace, and Lucas had departed for their cruise through a casual call to their neighbor. Then I contacted a colleague at my real estate agency, someone I trusted, and explained that I wanted to sell my property quickly and discreetly. My colleague was confused. But don't Thomas and Grace live there? It's complicated, I replied. But legally, the house is mine to sell. She agreed to help, and we listed the property immediately. Given the desirable neighborhood and the current market, we priced it slightly above what I had originally paid. Within 3 days, we had multiple offers. I accepted one from a family who could close quickly and who offered even more than the asking price. During this whirlwind of activity, I also began reconnecting with old friends I had neglected while trying to maintain my relationship with Thomas. I had lunch with former colleagues. I joined Diana for a weekend trip to the coast. I even went on a date with a kind widower Diana had introduced me to years before, but whom I had been too busy to meet. As I re-engaged with the world beyond my son's approval, I felt layers of anxiety and inadequacy beginning to peel away. I remembered who I had been before I became so desperate for Thomas's acceptance that I had lost myself. There was one painful task I needed to complete before the sale could proceed. Thomas and Grace had allowed me to store some personal belongings in their basement items. I claimed I had no room for, but that I actually left there as an excuse to visit. I needed to retrieve these things before the new owners took possession. I went to the house with Diana for moral support. Using my key, which Thomas had never asked me to return, we entered and headed straight for the basement. As we boxed up my holiday decorations and photo albums, I found something that made my heart stop: a large plastic bin filled with handmade gifts I had given Thomas and Grace over the years. The baby blanket I had knitted for Lucas. The scrapbook of Thomas's childhood I had created for their first anniversary. The hand-painted ornaments I made each Christmas. All stashed away in a dusty corner, never used, never displayed. Diana found me sitting on the concrete floor holding Lucas's baby blanket, tears streaming down my face. "This is why you're selling the house," she said gently, kneeling beside me. "Not out of revenge, but because they don't value what comes from your heart. They only value what costs money, and even then, they take it for granted." We finished packing my belongings, and as we left, I took one last look around the home I had sacrificed so much to provide. It was beautiful but cold, filled with expensive things but lacking warmth. It no longer represented the dream I had when I purchased it, a place where family gatherings would happen, where Lucas would run to the door to greet his grandmother, where Thomas and I would laugh about old times while Grace learned to appreciate the depth of our bond. That dream had never been real. It was time to let it go. The closing happened quickly, just 10 days after listing the property. I walked out of the attorney's office with a check for significantly more than I had paid for the house, enough to secure my retirement, buy a smaller place for myself, and still have money to help others who might be in the situation I had once been in. As I deposited the check, I felt both grief and liberation. Grief for the relationship I had wanted with my son, and liberation from the desperate need for his approval that had driven me to deplete my savings and sacrifice my future. I knew Thomas and Grace would be furious when they returned from their cruise to find strangers living in their house. I braced myself for the confrontation, arranging to stay with Diana for a few days when they were scheduled to return, just in case things got ugly. I didn't regret my decision, but I wasn't looking forward to defending it. The cruise was nearly over. Soon, Thomas and Grace would discover what I had done. Soon, I would find out if there was any hope of salvaging our relationship, or if this was truly the end of my connection with my son and grandson. Either way, I knew I had finally done something for myself, after a lifetime of putting Thomas first. It was long overdue. The call came at 2:17 a.m., 3 days after Thomas and his family were scheduled to return from their cruise. I had been expecting it, but the late hour still startled me awake from a fitful sleep. "What have you done?" Thomas's voice was a furious hiss on the other end of the line. "We just got home from the airport to find strangers in our house." "Strangers, Mom. They said they bought the place." "That's impossible. Tell me this is some kind of sick joke." Despite preparing for this moment for weeks, my heart still raced at the anger in his voice. "It's not a joke, Thomas. I sold the house." "You what?" he shouted loud enough that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "You can't do that. It's our house. You gave it to us." "I never legally transferred ownership," I said, keeping my voice calm despite my trembling hands. "The deed remained in my name. I paid all the taxes and insurance. Legally, it was still mine to sell." "This is insane," he sputtered. "Where are we supposed to live? What about all our things, Lucas's nursery? How could you do this to your own grandson?" The mention of Lucas sent a pang through my heart, but I steeled myself. "The new owners have put your belongings in storage. You can contact them about retrieval. The information was left with your temporary hotel accommodations, which I also arranged and paid for." There was a moment of stunned silence before Thomas spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. "You're going to regret this, Mom. We're coming over right now to sort this out." He hung up before I could respond. I immediately called Diana, who had insisted on staying with me for precisely this scenario. "They're on their way here," I told her, my voice shaking slightly. "Thomas sounds furious." "Good," Diana replied firmly. "Let him be furious. You've done nothing wrong. I'll be right there." I spent the next 30 minutes pacing my small apartment, rehearsing what I would say. Diana arrived just before Thomas's car screeched into my driveway. From the window, I watched Thomas Grace, and to my surprise, Grace's parents emerge. They approached my door like an invading army, Thomas in front with Grace right behind him, her parents following with expressions of cold disapproval. Diana squeezed my hand. "Remember why you did this?" she whispered as the doorbell rang. I opened the door and stepped aside wordlessly as they filed in. Grace was still wearing her resort clothes, her face flushed with outrage. Thomas looked like he hadn't slept, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. Charlotte and Richard, Grace's parents, stood slightly apart, their posture rigid with disdain. "How dare you!" Grace spat the moment the door closed. "How dare you sell our home out from under us while we were away? Do you have any idea who my father is? The legal resources we have? We will sue you for everything you have." I remained calm, gesturing to my living room. "Please sit down. Shouting won't resolve anything." "I don't want to sit down in this place," Grace said, looking around my modest apartment with thinly veiled disgust. "I want an explanation for why you've suddenly decided to destroy our lives." Thomas stepped forward, his voice slightly more controlled, but still vibrating with anger. "Mom, whatever issues you have with us could have been discussed. This is beyond inappropriate. It's cruel and possibly illegal. The house was a gift." "A gift you never formally received," I replied evenly. "The deed remained in my name. I paid all expenses related to the property. You contributed nothing." "Because you insisted on handling it all," Thomas shot back. "We offered to take over the payments." This was a blatant lie. They had never offered to contribute a penny, but I didn't call him out directly. Instead, I said, "The legal details aside, I think we need to address the real issue here. You told me I wasn't family, Thomas. You and Grace decided that I didn't belong in your lives except when it was convenient for you. You allowed Grace's parents to take precedence over me in every way." "This is about the cruise." Thomas looked incredulous. "You sold our house because you weren't invited on vacation." "No," I said firmly. "I sold the house because it represented a relationship that doesn't exist. I sacrificed my retirement and financial security to provide you with a home, and in return, you and Grace have systematically pushed me to the margins of your lives. The cruise was simply the final confirmation of what I already knew in your eyes. I'm not family." Grace made a sound of disgust. "So this is revenge. This is how petty and vindictive." Richard, Grace's father, spoke for the first time. "Valerie, this behavior is unconscionable. Grace and Thomas are now essentially homeless because of your emotional reaction to a perceived slight." "They're not homeless," I countered. "They have a luxury hotel suite paid for until they find a new place. And it wasn't a perceived slight, Richard. Thomas explicitly stated that I am not part of their family unit. Those were his exact words." Thomas at least had the grace to look slightly ashamed, but Grace was undeterred. "Fine, so we hurt your feelings. That doesn't justify what you've done. You've jeopardized our standing in the community. How are we supposed to explain to our friends that we've been evicted from our own home?" "It was never your home legally," Diana interjected, speaking for the first time. "And perhaps you could tell your friends the truth that you excluded Valerie from your family until she stopped bankrolling your lifestyle." Grace turned to Diana with a look of pure venom. "And who asked for your input? This is a family matter." "Oh, I thought I wasn't family," I said quietly. "Diana has been more family to me than you have allowed me to be to my own son and grandson." Charlotte stepped forward, placing a manicured hand on Grace's shoulder. This is getting us nowhere. Valerie, name your price. How much to buy a comparable house in the same neighborhood Richard and I will write a check right now. Her offer stunned me momentarily. They were willing to spend nearly $1 million rather than have Thomas and Grace live in a less prestigious neighborhood or, heaven forbid, apologize and make amends with me. This isn't about money, I said. It never was. Thomas, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly exploded. Then what is it about, Mom? What do you want from us? You've made your point. You've humiliated us. You've disrupted our lives and Lucas's life. Is that enough punishment for you? The mention of Lucas sparked a new thought. Where is Lucas, by the way? I noticed you didn't bring my grandson to this confrontation. He's with Grace's aunt, Thomas replied. We didn't want to expose him to this ugliness. Interesting choice, I observed. Grace's family is appropriate for Lucas, but his own grandmother isn't. Grace made a dismissive gesture. This is pointless. Thomas, we're leaving. Our lawyers will be in touch, Valerie. She spat my name like it tasted bad in her mouth. Before you go, I said, I want you to know that I'm willing to help you find an affordable rental. I'm not trying to leave you with nowhere to live. I just couldn't continue enabling a relationship where I was valued only for what I could provide financially. Thomas laughed bitterly. A rental. Do you hear yourself? We had a house in Brookline, and now you're offering to help us find a rental in Dorchester, Roxbury. His snobbery shocked me. These were perfectly nice areas where hardworking people lived, where I had lived before my real estate career took off. His contempt for these neighborhoods revealed how completely he had absorbed Grace's elitist worldview. Thomas, I said softly, do you remember where we lived when you were 10? The 2-bedroom apartment above the laundromat. You never complained then. You were happy with the little we had because we had each other. Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps a momentary recognition of the person he had once been, but Grace quickly extinguished it. We're done here, she announced. And Valerie, you should know that this decision has consequences. You will never see Lucas again. Ever. Thomas agrees with me on this. I looked at my son, searching for any sign of disagreement with his wife's cruel declaration, but he avoided my gaze. My heart shattered all over again. If that's your decision, I can't stop you, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. But consider what you're teaching Lucas about family, about forgiveness, about resolving conflicts. Is this really the example you want to set? Grace grabbed Thomas's arm. Let's go. This conversation is over. As they moved toward the door, Richard paused. Valerie, I don't approve of your methods, but I understand a parent's need to be acknowledged. Perhaps when tempers cool, we can revisit this situation more rationally. It was a small olive branch, the only one offered that night. I nodded slightly in acknowledgement. After they left, Diana and I sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, she spoke. Are you okay? I wasn't sure how to answer. I had stood my ground. I had refused to be walked over. But I had possibly lost my grandson forever. Was that a price I was willing to pay for self-respect? I don't know. I answered honestly. But I couldn't keep living as I was Diana. I couldn't keep pouring everything into a relationship that gave nothing back. Diana hugged me tightly. One day, Thomas might understand. And if he doesn't, then you're better off building a life that doesn't revolve around someone who doesn't appreciate you. I hoped she was right. As I tried to sleep that night, I kept seeing Lucas's face, wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life or taken the first painful step toward healing. 6 months passed without a word from Thomas or Grace. No calls, no texts, no emails. The first few weeks were excruciating. I would pick up my phone 12 times a day, my finger hovering over Thomas's number before I forced myself to put it down. I had to give him space to process what had happened. I had to allow myself time to heal as well. I used some of the money from the house sale to buy a comfortable but modest condo in a diverse neighborhood I loved. It was closer to my friends and favorite activities than my previous apartment had been. I furnished it entirely to my own taste for the first time in my adult life, not worrying about whether my choices were sophisticated enough or what Thomas and Grace might think. With Diana's encouragement, I also established a small foundation to help single mothers with housing expenses. We provided grants for security deposits, first month's rent, and emergency repairs. Each time we helped a young mother secure stable housing for her children, I felt a piece of my heart mend. I began to travel, something I had always wanted to do, but had postponed for decades while raising Thomas and then trying to maintain a place in his life. I visited the Grand Canyon, took a river cruise through Europe, spent 2 weeks exploring the coast of Maine. With each new experience, I reclaimed a bit more of myself. The holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving was a blur of tears and memories. For Christmas, Diana insisted I join her family celebration, which helped but couldn't completely fill the Lucas-shaped hole in my heart. I bought him presents anyway, wrapping them carefully and storing them in a closet for a day I wasn't sure would ever come. I started seeing a therapist, something I had never considered before. Dr. Levine helped me understand that my relationship with Thomas had become unhealthy long before the house incident. I had enabled his entitlement by never setting boundaries, by always giving without expectation of appreciation. I had tried to buy his love because I was afraid of losing him, as I had lost his father. These weren't comfortable realizations, but they were necessary for my healing. Spring arrived, bringing with it a renewed sense of possibility. My foundation was growing. I had made new friends through my travels and volunteer work. I was even enjoying a gentle courtship with Michael, the widower Diana had introduced me to, who was patient and kind and valued me for exactly who I was. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday in April, my phone rang with Thomas's number. My hand trembled as I answered. "Hello? Mom!" Thomas's voice sounded different, humbled somehow. "Can we meet somewhere to talk? Just the two of us?" We agreed to meet at a park where I used to take Thomas when he was little. It seemed fitting neutral territory with happy memories. I arrived early, my stomach in knots. When Thomas appeared, I was struck by how different he looked. Gone were the designer clothes and carefully styled hair. He wore simple jeans and a worn sweater. He had lost weight, and there were shadows under his eyes. We sat on a bench overlooking the duck pond, where he had spent countless hours as a child tossing breadcrumbs and making up stories about the duck families. "How are you, Mom?" he asked, his voice soft and uncertain. "I'm doing well," I replied honestly. "It's been a difficult time, but I'm finding my way. How about you? And Lucas and Grace?" Thomas sighed deeply. "That's partly why I wanted to talk to you. A lot has changed since we last saw each other." He explained that shortly after our confrontation, Grace's family had cut them off financially. The house incident had been embarrassing for the family and their social circle, and Richard and Charlotte had decided Thomas was a bad investment. Without my financial support, and now without Grace's family's backing, they had been forced to move to a small apartment in one of the neighborhoods Thomas had dismissed so contemptuously. "Grace hasn't adjusted well," Thomas admitted. "She blames me for not securing the house legally when you first gave it to us. She blames you for selling it. She's talking about moving back to her parents' place with Lucas, but without me." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I didn't want my son to suffer. "Don't be," Thomas replied, surprising me. "This whole situation has been a wake-up call." When Grace's parents cut us off, I realized something important. Their support was conditional, based on how I fit into their world, how I reflected on them. But your support, Mom, was always unconditional. You gave and gave without expecting anything in return, until you finally couldn't anymore. Tears welled in my eyes as he continued. "I've been thinking a lot about the kind of man I became, the kind of son. I'm ashamed, Mom. I let Grace and her family convince me that their validation was worth more than our relationship. I chose status over the person who had sacrificed everything for me. Thomas, I began, but he shook his head. Please, let me finish. I need to say this. What you did with the house was shocking, and yes, it made me angry. But it also forced me to see what I had become. Living in our new neighborhood, I've remembered what it's like to be around real people who don't judge you by your zip code or your yacht club membership. I've remembered the values you taught me that I dismissed so easily. I reached out and took his hand, noticing the absence of his expensive watch. I never wanted to hurt you, Thomas. I just couldn't keep enabling a relationship where I was treated as an outsider. I know that now. He nodded. And I want you to know, I'm sorry. Profoundly sorry for the way I treated you, for the things I said, for letting Grace and her family dictate my relationship with you. You deserved so much better. We talked for hours, more honestly than we had in years. Thomas explained that he was looking for a new job, one based on his actual skills, rather than connections from Grace's family. He was trying to save his marriage, but wasn't sure it could be salvaged now that their circumstances had changed so dramatically. What about Lucas? I finally asked the question that had been burning in my heart. Grace said I would never see him again. Thomas looked genuinely remorseful. That was cruel and wrong. Lucas asks about you, you know. He has the photo of the two of you at the park on his dresser. He calls you Gamma. Tears spilled down my cheeks at this revelation. I've missed him so much. Would you like to see him this weekend? Thomas asked. I'll have him on Saturday. Grace has reluctantly agreed that you should be part of his life, though she may never forgive you for the house. I'd love that more than anything, I whispered. As we parted, Thomas hugged me tightly, something he hadn't done with genuine feeling in years. I'm trying to be a better man, Mom. The kind of man you raised me to be before I lost my way. I hope it's not too late. It's never too late to find your way back to what matters, I told him. That Saturday, the sound of small footsteps running toward me as Lucas shouted, Gamma, healed something deep inside me that I feared would be broken forever. Over the following months, Thomas and I rebuilt our relationship carefully, with new boundaries and mutual respect. Grace remained distant, but gradually became less hostile as she adjusted to their new circumstances. Sunday dinners at my condo became a tradition sometimes, with Grace always with Thomas and Lucas. One year after our reconciliation, we celebrated Lucas's 3rd birthday at my place. As I watched Thomas helping his son blow out the candles, I reflected on our difficult journey. The pain had been necessary. Sometimes, relationships need to break before they can be rebuilt on a healthier foundation. Make a wish, Lucas, I called as he took a deep breath to blow out his candles. I wish for everyone to be happy, he declared, breaking the cardinal rule of birthday wishes by saying it out loud. Thomas caught my eye across the table and smiled. I think that wish might already be coming true, buddy. Family isn't defined by houses or vacations or social status. It's defined by love, respect, and the willingness to work through even the most painful conflicts. It took losing almost everything for Thomas to understand this, and it took standing up for myself for me to remember my own worth. Have you ever had to take a difficult stand to save a relationship that mattered to you? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. If this resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe to support more stories of family healing and personal growth. And remember, sometimes the hardest choices lead to the greatest healing. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope wherever your family journey takes you, you find the courage to value yourself as much as you value others.